So when we're talking about maintaining confidence in evangelism, do you think it's this issue of just how much longer it's taking that is the area we've got to keep saying to people, don't lose your nerve? Is that,
I think so. And I remember you saying, and I remember completely agreeing, that the old illustration was, here's the chasm of sin. There's God on one side, there's you on the other side. You can't cross, but here is the cross of Jesus. Walk over. That just doesn't work. That was the expectation. Yeah. Certainly 40 years ago, you expected the very binary darkness to light miracle. I've been saved. That's not happening. People aren't on the edge of the cliff. They don't even see there's a chasm. They don't understand what's sin in, and they've certainly got no notion of God. They're a mile back, and they have 101 little hurdles. And by God's grace, as they interact with believers, as they maybe come to a church service, as they maybe do the Word one-to-one, as they maybe go on Christianity Explored or Life Explored, these little questions are being answered. And what John said has been precisely my experience. Well, more than one occasion pastoring, I'd be chatting to someone after a service, and I'd say to them, I think you've become a Christian. And they say, yeah, actually, I think I have. Because they hadn't realised it was one of those micro decisions. But by God's grace.
So how do we keep people encouraged in this new environment where it's taking longer? We know God opens blind eyes, but it seems to me in his providence it's taking longer. How do we keep them going?
I think there are two fundamental issues that people wrestle with. One is, I think, their fear of speaking of Jesus. So I think there's no doubt that we are fearful of what people will think. Yeah. We don't like being embarrassed. We don't like standing out. So there is a problem of a lack of courage that needs to be overcome. Yes. But closely related to that is, I think people are crushed by the apathy of those around them who don't want to hear the gospel. So what I find in many churches is Christians who would love their friends and neighbours to be wanting to find out about Christ, and they try, but their friends and neighbours are frankly not interested. And then they find all sorts of polite ways of ever avoiding talking about it. So they know you're a Christian. They know that you're probably trying to win them and convert them. But if they're not interested, it's very, very hard to push it when there's an unwillingness to receive. I think sometimes we think of evangelism as something that we do, and we've got our idea of who we want to speak to when we want to speak to them. But people don't kind of respond to that in the way we want. I think we need to be willing to work with God more. And he opens up moments of opportunity. He opens up opportunities with people where you may never expect it. One of our frustrations is that evangelism doesn't always work to our timescale with the people we want to work with.
I was struck in your little book on the state of the nation, just that actually for a lot of churches, particularly in the sort of the traditional bastion of evangelicalism, the white middle class, that's particularly true, this apathy. So what is that, John? Is that just a profound idolatry that's going on there? How do you diagnose this apathy that means that these churches that often are the sort of backbone of evangelicalism in this country are pretty discouraged?
Jesus would say it's hard for the rich to enter into the kingdom of God. And we've got a generation of well-educated, rich, sort of relatively rich people whose lives are more comfortable materially than they've ever been, whose lives are probably healthier than they've ever been in previous generations. And I think to them at certain stages of their life, when death seems a long way away, when they've got heads down on careers, kids, and they feel successful, they don't feel any need of the gospel, and they don't think that the gospel will be capable of addressing the problems that they are wrestling with. And they've also, of course, got a narrative, as Andy was saying at the beginning, of how Christianity has failed. So therefore, we're not just in a pre-Christian culture, we are actually in a post-Christian culture. And that makes it more difficult to help persuade them that the gospel is sort of relevant to their lives. And I think at this moment of history, that just happens to be the group that it's hardest to bring the gospel to. Maybe 50 years ago, that was the group that was most open to the gospel. And the way that God works is it seems that different groups, different people, different nations are more open or closed at different times in his sovereignty. So if I look at what's happening around the country at the moment, great openness amongst Iranians. It's still the case that most people become Christian under the age of 18. So if you happen to be in a church in a context in which you're predominantly white, reasonably wealthy and successful middle class people and not many young people, you're not likely to see as many converts, because that is the community that at the moment seems to be least open to the gospel.
And if you were in that situation, what would you be saying to those?
Well, my own experience is not of a white, rich, middle-class background. For 24 years, I pastored a church that was on what was called the most dangerous street in the whole of the UK. And
Easton in Bristol.
Yeah, Easton in Bristol. And we saw, blessing, we did see conversions. One because of the ethnic mix that was there, and one because of the need. Whereas I think to work in the white suburbs is probably the hardest, humanly speaking, gig that you could have as a pastor, because people are happy, they're content. Whereas when you work amongst the poor, for example, when we did door to door, if you had more than 4 visits an hour, you'd think, well, this has been a bad time, because folks will chat. There was need, they would be speaking about that need, you'd be able to speak into their lives. And also I think part of the incoming migrant population was really helpful. Many of them had a far deeper Christian heritage that was then being built on than ever we did. You mentioned the Hope UK questionnaire and the results. What encouraged me was that they were saying, and again, you'll know the figure better than I, Rico, what the response rate was. That is it 1 in 4 would be interested to hear. To me, it was a really encouraging figure.
Of the 67% of people who have a Christian friend they like, 1 in 5 would want to know more. If someone said to them, would you like to know more about Jesus? Now the question is, they weren't going to say to their friend, I want to know more. They needed to be asked. There was a pain line to be crossed, but that was 7.5 million people who were saying, look, if someone asks me who I like, do I want to know more? I'll say yes. So whenever I'm doing the sort of evangelism training, I'm saying there's 7.5 million people out there who like you and would like to know more. Now that doesn't mean they're going to come to church, but they will have a personal chat. They would get the Bible open, and I think that's true. So I think the great issue is courage. The great issue is courage of saying, look, are we ready to be rejected? So I've got to have in my identity, whether you accept or reject me doesn't make me more valuable. What makes me valuable is Christ died for me. And then have a go. Now what we're finding is the people that are having a go are loving it, but vast numbers who were never read with the Bible one-to-one themselves. So that, I don't know what we do about that. What do you do when someone's own tradition has been, I just went along, I was in a group, the discipleship was done by osmosis at the dining room table by mum and dad. You know, they've not had this intentional one-to-one, one-to-two stuff. So that's what I'm struggling at my church, that you know, I think they think the Bible one-to-one or one-to-two is a good thing, but it's just not with the culture they were brought up with. So unless they're a NAV or a Scripture Union product, it's not something they feel natural with. I don't know how you get that going, but it's a frustration for me at the moment.
I think culture change takes often a long period of time, and people have to see the different way of doing things beginning to work and feel its benefits. Yes. And actually, at one level, it needs to keep being taught and promoted, but then also shown. Yes. And you'll never persuade everybody to adopt all at the same time. So you, in a sense, have to just hope that gradually more and more people will get it and will come on board. But with almost any initiative and proposal, you're never going to get 100% buy-in. No. So in a way, you have to work to just simply increase the number of people who are prepared to make a change.
But what struck me in your book was that the stuff you wrote about individuality, that people are just not living their lives locally. And therefore, again, that makes this, you know, for those listening, even more of a crisis, because unless we can mobilize people individually much better than we were, that ability to say, look, here's the community, they'll just become part of it. It's becoming, I mean, I remember you did this description of someone who's a single mum working here, parents are there, husband is over there. I mean, it was just a brutal scenario in terms of time management.
And I think that's the challenge, because people are not living in communities in the way that they once were. So how do you connect with them? How do they form friendships? How do you do evangelism as a local church, where when your people who are in work, the people they're actually able to evangelize live way away, would never come to your church? So you have to work in a much more interconnected way there. I think there are certain stages of life in which there's more opportunity. So we've certainly found, and I've seen this across a lot of churches, that points of life at which there seems to be most potential for connection with the local church are through mums and toddlers groups, post-retirement, and then through moments of life at which there are crises or problems. So often people who have no connection with church at all, when they suffer a relationship breakdown, a bereavement, an illness, if they've got Christians who they can turn to, that might open up to an opportunity. I think we shouldn't underestimate the value of social media. So again, we've found, because people live in communities that are connected by WhatsApp or Facebook, again, that becomes a vehicle to talk about your faith and to be able to invite people to things. So people in our church have found inviting their Facebook friends to come to church events is almost more effective. The friends find it easier to turn it down, and they also find it easier to just turn up without having said whether they're going to come or not. So we have to work around some of those cultural features and not always see them as the enemy, but see them as just a demographic or sociological reality that we need to work with.
Hard to get people into community though, isn't it? Even if they can be floating there for a long time, and to try and draw them in. So I think one of the battles with Word One-to-One, which is a great tool, is Richard Bourganon would say it's moving people who love meeting with me individually into what does it mean to be in church life.
Well, I think one of the geniuses of the Alpha course, and one of the reasons why it was so successful, is because it managed to combine the gospel with church. So in the process of evangelizing, it didn't disconnect becoming a Christian with then being part of the Christian community. So for those who did the Alpha course, they not only had sort of gospel content, but then it would talk about what the church is and what the church does. So people were being prepared to be part of the community. Now that may well have been most effective in reaching, in a sense, unconverted church members in many contexts, but it managed to ensure that evangelism was not just coming to a personal relationship with Christ, but was also coming into relationship with his people. And I think we do need to find ways that we communicate that.
Guys, here's what haunts me. So I think about Judgment Day, and I think of many people who'll say, as they are being facing the judgment and being taken to hell, you never warned me. They'll say, you never told me there was a place called hell, that this was what was at stake.
I think, I say this carefully, but I think at times we may have got evangelism wrong, our understanding of evangelism wrong. We've professionalized evangelism. We expect everyone to evangelize as an evangelist. Now, you, brother, are an evangelist, and I am so profoundly grateful to God for you. But not everyone is an evangelist. And it strikes me from what the scriptures teach us, Colossians 4:6 and 1 Peter 3, that we're to live deliciously distinctive lives and be ready to give an answer for the hope that's within us. So in other words, there is going to be a lifestyle wherever we are, work, community, we're just going to be living under the lordship of Christ. And that should be far more radical than I think it is at the moment. And we should be expecting that God sovereignly is going to give us opportunities to speak for him. Why do you tick like that? How have you coped with that grief situation? What do you think about this? And a lot of our people have ducked out of evangelism because the cost is too high, or they see it as let's get them into the building. Now, the building has a place. I'm not knocking that for one. I think there is some value in attractional gatherings, but I think those things they give us the macro story. They put the story together, whereas what we need are the people who are doing the micro story. This is Jesus and me. This is why I'm living as I do. And that, therefore, involves every single person. You see, to some people, evangelism is now an optional extra in their Christian life. And it's what the evangelist at church does, or it's the guilt trip that the pastor puts on us. Whereas if we can get over, just live and enjoy Jesus and expect and be looking out and be ready to give an answer when these discussions emerge. Have this Christian mindset that we've been talking about so that you're able to respond. And it strikes me, our people are not warning people of hell because they think that's what you do. And we need to understand that.
Well, I don't do it very well. I mean, I'm not sitting here and saying I do. I'm speaking on hell at GAFCON. We've got this conference for the sort of Orthodox Anglican Southern Hemisphere, called by the Archbishop of Nigeria and Sydney, but but I'm sort of thinking, gosh, are we even articulating this?
I think there are a couple of things there. I think I'd say that we need to completely recapture the biblical emphasis that the gospel is a message about deliverance from the wrath to come. And I think we've actually lost that within evangelicalism. I think that is rarely what we proclaim. We proclaim the love of God. We proclaim the blessings of the Christian life. We proclaim a psychological wholeness, which is basically a therapeutic prosperity gospel. And I don't think we recognise that the gospel is first and foremost a message of a judgment that is coming and an opportunity to be saved and rescued from it. And going back to talking about stories, I think that we need to remember that the Christian story only makes sense in the light of coming judgment and resurrection. It is an eschatological story. So the Christian message is not come to Jesus and your life will be better. The message is come to Jesus, pick up your cross, be prepared to be condemned by the world and bear the shame of following Christ with the hope of a glorious eternal inheritance. So if we expect blessing now and a good life now by following Christ, well, we've not read our New Testaments, but then we'll distort our story. So the story only makes sense in being those who can enter into the inheritance on the other side of the judgment. So it ought to be at the heart of our proclamation. So I think, Rico, we do need to communicate the message of judgment and the message of hell. And I think you're also right to say this sort of burden that we ought to feel to share that message with others, because we don't want them to face the judgment because we've not told them. But I think actually for us as Christians sharing the gospel, one of the great dangers is most Christians do feel an immense burden of failure because of who they've not spoken to, because of perhaps people haven't responded. The Bible isn't calling people to spend every minute of every day warning people around them of the coming of judgment and hell. So I think we have to have a confident trust in God that if we take the opportunities that are given and we speak honestly and truthfully about what the gospel is, God will accomplish his purpose through doing that. And I personally, I'm an unashamed Calvinist. I believe in the sovereignty of God. And I think having a proper understanding of the sovereignty of God, but human responsibility alongside it, is crucial to being an evangelist who maintains psychological balance. Because we do have a responsibility to speak, but in the end, salvation is not down to us. And I take it from what the Bible says that not one person will be lost from God's salvation because of our failure. That God will save his people, and that God will have a means of doing that because he's planned it. And I find that Paul's teaching in Romans 9 to 11, therefore, is absolutely crucial. Paul there is explaining how many of the Jews he's spoken to have not believed. And he feels the pain of that immensely. He almost wishes he could be cursed rather than them. But he also recognises God is absolutely sovereign. And in a real sense, he's not failed. And I think Christians fall into two mistakes when they think about the sovereignty of God. One is to think that if God is sovereign, I don't need to do anything. But that's not what Paul concludes. Paul's conclusion in Romans 9 to 11 is, I'm going to pray passionately and preach passionately. He's going to take every opportunity he can to share the good news of the gospel. But at the same time, he knows that ultimately the responsibility is not his, that God has his sovereign ways. And I think if our Christian people could hold both of those together, a passionate desire to be praying and sharing the gospel, coupled with a confidence that God is sovereign and he will accomplish his purposes, that to my mind gives us a freedom and a liberation to be able to engage in the work of the gospel without being psychologically crushed.
How do you know which one of those two you're sort of, because I think Don Carson in that chapter 9 of Spiritual Reformation, it's an amazing chapter when he says, I almost stopped praying. There he was writing his PhD on this contrast or this paradox. How do you think you know which one you're falling into, sort of?
Well, I would say in the Christian life, you're probably always falling into one of them more than the other. I would say it's a little bit more like a pinball machine in which we kind of tend to bounce between both sides. But the key is never to fall into the hole. And what we have to do is we have to just keep self-correcting. So actually, at most points, I will be over towards one extreme rather than the other. And at that point, I need to realise it and recorrect. So I may need to recover the passion for praying and preaching, or I may have to recover the confidence in God's sovereignty. So I think a right self-reflection helps you to be able to do that.
And I think Paul's experience in Athens is massively helpful in that context. It begins with Paul. It talks about him being in paroxysm. He was deeply distressed when he saw the idolatry. Then we have Luke giving us one of the glorious accounts of evangelistic work. He dialogued in the Agora with the so quaint little philosophers there, and then he went to the Areopagus and presented, and no doubt we have it's short form, we have it, but he presented one of the great gospel sermons, which was bold, which was clear. And how did it finish? Most of them just said, we're not interested. There were one or two conversions, and I think we hold that together, don't we? We do all that we can.